Hi, and welcome to the Origins Podcast. I'm your host, Lawrence Krauss. I'm really excited to introduce a new segment of the Origins Podcast, What's New in Science, with Sabine Hossenfelder and me. Sabine is a well-known science popularizer from Germany. She's got a very popular YouTube channel. She's a physicist like myself and is opinionated like I am. And we had the idea of talking about science in the news with a critical eye. A lot of science is discussed in the news rather uncritically, and I couldn't think of a better person to have that kind of co-hosting role with a discussion about popular topics in science than Sabine, and I was very happy she agreed to do it. And this, our inaugural episode, we talk about 4 current topics in science, ranging from relatively esoteric ones to ones that are more practical, and all of them have been in the news in recent times. We talk about recent hype associated with claims of quantum computing, about climate change and what's happening with related to the most recent election in the United States, recent remarkable discoveries from the asteroid Bennu, from material brought back to Earth that has bases of nucleotides for that are the 4 of the 5 bases of DNA nucleotides, as well as numerous amino acids, and the implications of that for finding life elsewhere in the universe. And finally, claims for nuclear fusion being practical at an industrial level. A bunch of startup companies are making claims, and we investigate those. It was a wonderful discussion, and particularly nice to see our different perspectives. I think it's important for the public to see that, especially at the cutting edge of science, that people can have different perspectives of new results, even if we, of course, agree on the fundamentals. And Sabine is a wonderful person to be able to have that discussion with, and I was incredibly excited about the way it came out, and I'm hoping this will be a regular segment on our podcast and very popular. So I hope you enjoyed as much as we did, and you can watch it ad-free on our Critical Mass Substack site, and if you subscribe to that, the proceeds will go to supporting the Origins Project Foundation, which is the nonprofit foundation that supports this podcast and other activities. Or you can watch it on our YouTube channel, our Origins Podcast YouTube channel, or listen to it on any podcast listening site. No matter how you watch it or listen to it, I think you'll find this conversation stimulating, entertaining, and hopefully informative. So with no further ado, What's New in Science with Sabine Hossenfelder and me. Well, welcome to the Origins Podcast, a brand new segment and new series which I'm quite excited about, which for the moment we're going to call What's New in Science with Sabine Hossenfelder and me. I'm really excited that Sabine is joining me as co-host of this new series to talk about new and interesting things in science, and I can't think of a better person or a person I'd more enjoy bantering with on science than Sabine, who has become amazingly popular for her YouTube videos on science in general and discussions, and of course her 2 books, Lost in Math and Existential Physics, about science and physics. And we both have sometimes we have different takes on things. I think we're both opinionated, and that should make it more fun. And so thank you for coming on, Sabine.
Well, I'm always excited to talk about science news.
Great. And today, so we've picked 4 different topics, and the plan will be for us to talk about a different topic together and introduce it, and then give our ideas. And the first topic I want to talk about, since I know Sabine, in fact, in some sense, Sabine's first book was about hype in physics, Lost in Math. And both of us, and I've written about hype in science, and I think it's one of the worst things scientists can do, is to give hype, because it comes back and bites us in the butt. And the greatest hype I know of recently has to do with quantum computing. You wanna talk about it for a second, Sabine, or a minute, and introduce what the issue is?
Yeah, well, what made headlines very prominently a couple of weeks ago was the idea that quantum computing can somehow prove the existence of parallel worlds or the multiverse. And it goes back to a press release or a blog post, actually, from Google, where they announced their Willow chip with the 105 qubits, and that they did some very interesting things about it. And it had this additional statement about referring to David Deutsch, who's been going on about this for a long time. So it's not like it's a new thing. But of course, it was this one sentence that people picked up on, which said, "Wow, they proved the existence of parallel universes," right? When what they actually did was they showed that the quantum computer works as advertised, basically following the rules of quantum mechanics. Yeah, and so I got a
Yeah.
lot of questions about this.
It really caught on. I mean, I saw it everywhere. Oh, parallel universe has now been discovered, and of course, it's the stuff of science fiction, and this literally, in some sense, is science fiction because what, as you point out, what they did was a calculation using a quantum computer, the way quantum computers are supposed to do the calculation, and they did it, and that's not new, by the way. Other quantum computers have done calculations in the past, quantum computer calculations with fewer qubits, perhaps. And it's not even clear whether the calculation they did, which I understand took them 5 minutes and they claim would take 10 septillion years for a normal computer to do. But those claims are always also often shown to be wrong. But independent of that, it's a calculation designed so that a quantum computer could do it fast. It's not a calculation that's pressing in physics, but it just uses the fact that a quantum computer uses the properties of quantum mechanics. And the properties of quantum mechanics is that a system, um, especially in advance of measuring it, can exist in many different states at the same time. And you can utilize that to, in principle, essentially do an follow it along and sort of do many different calculations at the same time using, as long as you don't measure the system. The fact that it isn't in any one state allows you to do things you couldn't do for standard computer calculation where each bit is either in plus one or minus one or one or zero. And these qubits can be in many different configurations at the same time. So there's nothing new about that. But some people like to think that the fact that quantum mechanics allows superpositions to uh, means that we must have a multiverse. There must be parallel universes. Namely, the oldest example of this, of course, came from what's called the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics. Hugh Everett, who argued that the way to understand quantum mechanics classically is that every time you make quantum systems in many states at the same time, every time you measure it, you find it one state, but that branches the wave function so that there are many other possible universes where you could have made another measurement and got a different value. And every time you make a measurement, the universe branches out into essentially almost an infinite number of other branches, and it keeps branching and branching and branching. And it, given the mathematics of quantum mechanics, that's a possible classical interpretation of quantum mechanics. But my problem is, and I don't know if it's your problem, I don't understand why people get fixated on classical interpretations of quantum mechanics, because the world is quantum mechanical. And whenever you impose some classical picture on it, you're going to end up with something weird, like the many worlds interpretation. As Sidney Coleman has pointed out, you don't have to think, though. You really should think about not what a classical interpretation of quantum mechanics, but you should think of the classical world as an approximation to the real world, and why you want to have any. It's having a classical interpretation of quantum mechanics is like describing general relativity in curved space as if it's flat. You're always going to end up with weird things. Do you agree?
Yeah, kind of, except that I think I don't agree on your use of the word classical. But let me maybe say one thing about this entire many worlds interpretation. I think there's a conflation going on between two different ideas. So in this quantum computers, as you point out, this has been done before. Basically, Google did exactly the same thing already in 2019. Just with 57 qubits instead of 105. So they could have made the same claim back then, but they didn't. So
Yeah.
now they've tapped on gold, basically. So
Better PR.
universe, yeah. So I actually think this wasn't deliberate. It was just something that they threw into this blog post out of curiosity, maybe.
Yeah. Yeah.
In any case, so what they're going on about is that if you make a computation on this quantum computer, you need all these different sorts of entanglement swaps and whatnot. So you create a really huge superposition, which doesn't really have a correspondence in our normal way of thinking. And some people interpret this as there being many parallel computations in other universes. Okay, it's an interpretation of the maths. So I don't particularly like it, but it's just an interpretation. Now, the many worlds interpretation is actually a much stronger claim. It's about what happens after the measurement. So in the normal standard interpretation, you have this huge superposition of possible different things, but when you make a measurement, you get only one. So this is the collapse of the wave function. And all the many worlds interpretation, you say that collapse doesn't happen. So it's just that for every possible outcome, there's a separate universe. And normally, when we talk about the multiverse in the context of quantum mechanics, that's what people have in mind, this many worlds interpretation. But this is actually not what this experiment was about. And it's also not, I think, what the author of the blog post was going on about, and what David Deutsch was going on about when he was talking about how quantum computers work. Now, David Deutsch is he's a defender of the many worlds interpretation as well, but I still think that these are actually two separate things that got thrown together, and it wasn't particularly helpful.
And so the key idea here is, again, before measurement, there's no measurement, that because the system is in a superposition, which means that it's, if you want to think about it, again, if you want to think about it classically, you might not like that term, the system is in many different states at the same time, and the wave function it has if you were to measure it, would give you what state it's in with a given probability. But it's in the key point about quantum superpositions is that the specific configuration of each qubit is not fixed. It can be in many different configurations at the same time, and the Deutsche interpretation, or at least this interpretation, is that as you propagate this system involving many different states at the same time, you have essentially many different parallel universes going, many different parallel classical universes at the same time. But I mean, as I say, that's just words. When I harken back to really the first, in my mind, still the clearest way of thinking about quantum mechanics comes from Richard Feynman, for me at least, and he was the first person to argue that you could do quantum mechanical and ultimately quantum field theoretic calculations by recognizing that a particle takes many different paths at the same time, and you can calculate the probability of each path. That's what the wave function basically does, and that gives you, and in the end, that can tell you what the likelihood of a particle that starts in one place will end up in another place in quantum mechanics. So the many path interpretation of quantum mechanics, but he never talked about other universes. It's just the way the world is, that that an electron literally is doing many different things at the same time, whether you like it or not. And that doesn't mean you need any extra dimensions. If it's a crutch for you to picture it, that's fine, but that crutch doesn't make it true. And I think that's the real problem, is that people somehow feel the need to assign some reality to that kludge, to that clutch you're using just to give you some mental picture.
Yeah, I totally agree with this. Though I think one shouldn't underestimate the value of finding a different way to think about it. So, I mean, obviously for David, it was super useful to think about it in this particular way, because it helped him to do some groundbreaking work on quantum computing with this particular understanding. So I have no specific problem with it. But as you say, one shouldn't confuse the mathematics with the reality.
Yeah, and Feynman was big on that too, and the fact that he often thought that it'd be useful for him as a physicist and anyone else to sometimes think of the same mathematics using different pictures. And the actually, an example that he used that I still like to talk about to students when I teach or to the public is mirage on a highway. And when you look out, or in the desert, when you look out on a hot day and you look at the highway in the distance, you see what looks like water. And the standard physical explanation is, well, there are many layers of air. The hottest air is down near the road, and the coolest layers are above. And when light from the sky comes in, at each layer, it bends, it refracts, because when light goes from material one density to another, it bends, and it keeps bending and bending and bending until it comes back up to you. And so what you're looking is light that came from the sky. Well, that's a great interpretation. But Feynman also pointed out, it wasn't the first one to point this out, but that actually there's a principle of least time. Another way of thinking about it is that light travels faster, since the speed of light changes in materials of different density. It travels faster in the least dense material, which is hot air. So the light, if you want to think about it this way, looks around at all possible trajectories from there to your eye and realizes by zipping down and spending more time near the ground, it can travel faster and then come up to your eye. And indeed, if you use that picture, you get exactly the same answer for the trajectory of light. And so they're very different classical pictures. And sometimes one picture is useful for you if you're a physicist and trying to think about how to go to the next step. Sometimes another picture is useful, but they're just pictures that we use to help us try and understand things in a way that we move forward to in science. But we shouldn't take them more seriously than that.
Yeah, basically agree with that.
Okay, good.
So
Well, I think we've beaten that dead horse until until it's, well, I'm not sure. These horses have a hard time dying, but it'll resurface again, I'm sure. But it's nice to combat that hype. The next subject has to do with climate science, and you, when I was asking you what was intriguing you recently, you were talking about that, and there's a little bit of politics and how and the implications of the Trump administration. So I'll throw that out to you.
Well, yeah, I've just been wondering, seeing what's going on in the United States now with the Trump administration withdrawing from from the Paris Agreement again. How is it going to develop? You've probably followed this. There are some banking alliances, it's called the Net Zero Banking Alliance or something, where banks collected and say, well, we have sustainable goals and all that kind of stuff. And one big bank after the other has left the alliance. And then there are like some hedge fund, which is called like the Net Zero
Net
Management
zero.
or whatever. So it's kind of, and they pause their operations. And a lot of companies like BP and Shell, they're dialing back their carbon neutrality commitments. And basically, it's like fossil fuel is back in fashion.
Mhm.
And that Trump says he wants to do baby drill.
Yeah, Bill, and in fact, he said that, and there's a, and as you probably know, the new proposed Secretary of Energy is the head of an oil and gas company, in the United States, and so there definitely is the verbiage that, well, there's a commitment for the United States to basically um, dial back all its treaty commitments and also any incentives uh, to address new technologies that might address climate change, which is interesting, of course, because as you know, Trump has come out against, say, the incentives for electric vehicles, and whereas his right-hand man, Elon Musk, produces lots of vehicles. I, I, I'm going to say something that will get me in trouble with Musk lovers, but I do that all the time anyway. Um, I actually think that such an dialing it back is actually probably better for Musk. And that's one of the reasons Musk has said he doesn't want them to be incentives anymore. And I think the reason is that first of all, their technology is established. Secondly, the way the incentives works is once you sell more than a certain number of vehicles in a given brand that are electric, those incentives go away. And a number of his vehicles have already passed those number of sales. So fewer of his models will be affected than other companies that are bringing on new vehicles, which might have been relying on that incentive. So I always wonder about self-interest, but in any case, there's certainly the verbiage to stop that, and I think that ultimately, like many of these things, I think it's going to come back and bite at least the U.S. in the butt, because other countries are developing technologies, China and other countries, and working forward to develop technologies, electric vehicles, for example. And if if the United States cuts back and other countries don't, it's not going to help climate change. It's not going to help address climate change. But in terms of creating new technologies, which are going to produce new value in the long run, uh, uh, once sustainability comes back in fashion, it'll put the United States behind a little bit, I think.
Well, my interpretation is that the Americans are betting very bigly on artificial intelligence. Like, artificial intelligence is supposed to save the day, and that justifies everything. Like, in this energy for the data centers has to come from somewhere, and it doesn't really matter. It could be gas or oil or what have you. Nuclear is back in fashion also. And I'm very skeptical about this. So I mean, look, data centers and infrastructure and grid extensions and so on are good for many things. But I think I agree with you that abandoning the energy transition goals in the end will turn out to be a dumb move, exactly because other countries are doing it, and in the end, the United States will be behind. So it seems to me a much bigger gamble than many people realize.
Yeah, no, I say this in spite of the fact that it's like one of these double-edged swords. A broken clock is right twice a day, and I think the same thing is true for Trump. And I am also sympathetic with some of the concerns that he and his allies have about hype about climate change, about climate disasterism, about the world is going to end, and that doesn't help either. Um, and and I'm absolutely in agreement that when it comes to the third world, we can't tell them, well, you can't develop hydroelectric dams or use fossil fuels because they need to come up to speed, and that means we're going to be burning some fossil fuels to make that happen. And we should assist, but we should also assist for moving beyond that. Um, so like in the case of some wokeness, what they do is they use the extremes to argue, that these people are going to say the world is going to end and we have to do something tomorrow, or the people who might say, for example, that the fires in Los Angeles are due to climate change, which no one can say unambiguously. I mean, there's a lot of factors of the fires in Los Angeles, and so if you use those misstatements, then it allows you to retrench very effectively, and and uh, and it's also one doesn't know, but of course it's also short-sighted. The United States is a major oil and gas producer, and but at the same time, it's interesting that Trump in his first term negotiated with the Saudis to reduce oil and gas production to raise the price of oil and gas, probably induced by his American friends who owned oil and gas businesses. And so it's really, these things are all conflated. But in general, my argument for addressing climate change or looking for new technologies is always a positive one. That developing new technologies generally is economically a good thing, and that new technologies will generally help your economy, and therefore there's nothing wrong with trying to develop new technologies to address and make the world more sustainable. And the other argument I have is that I wrote a book, as you know, on the physics of climate change. In fact, I think you may have even written a blurb for it. I can't remember, but um, there's some climate change is unambiguous and happening, and the physics is quite simple. There are many aspects of it that we can't make predictions about, and some of the worst predictions, of course, are the most speculative. But sometimes it makes me think of I know you don't watch much TV. Maybe you watch movies. Do Clint Eastwood and Dirty Harry? Did you ever watch those movies where he was a policeman
Absolutely.
and he used to point this gun at the bad guy, and he'd say, "I'm not sure if there's any bullets in this gun. Do you feel lucky, punk?" And I ultimately kind of feel the same way about the world. If there's a risk of something really bad, even if it's speculative, what you might want to think about is, are you feeling lucky? Or if it's possible that it could be very bad, what's the harm in at least thinking of productive ways of avoiding that possibility? I don't know how you.
Yeah, I agree with this. I'm also quite unhappy about the way that things have developed. That you have these two very strongly polarized camps, where in the one camp people are like, "Is this no problem? We don't need to worry about anything." And then on the other side, you have the world is going to end, the apocalypse is coming. And I think the truth is somewhere in the middle. And so I'm like, well, where are the reasonable people? Like, the people who have like reasonable risk assessments.
Yeah.
I think
Mm.
this is what we need. Like, what's the thing to invest into? And I actually, I'm a big fan of free markets and so on if they work.
Mhm.
But basically, the entire reason we have a problem with climate change is that the markets failed us because we didn't put a price on carbon, and that problem still hasn't been fixed. So we can't rely on the free market to fix the problem. So this all makes it very complicated because you then have to ask, okay, so what do we do and who pays for it? If not private investors, because they don't have any incentives.
Yeah.
Yeah. So and then in this situation, just saying, oh, we're going to stop supporting all these new technologies and so on, especially after you've already put a lot of money into it. I mean, even if it
Yes.
wasn't your administration, that's a pretty dumb thing to do. And there's also, I don't know if you read about this, but this sudden funding freeze left a lot of people, like small people,
Yeah.
hard workers,
Yeah.
like really struggling to figure out what are they going to do. They might already have begun actually building something, I don't know, solar panels on their roof or some,
Yeah.
the cleaner whatnot for their business
Yeah.
or whatever, and now they don't know if the money's going to come in. Like, this is a huge problem. and
Yeah.
and so this punishes like the wrong people.
It's the uncertainty that makes it really bad. Every business tries to make decisions based on some prediction of the future. And suddenly all those predictions are thrown out when your uncertainty is going, it's really difficult, especially as you point out for small business owners who don't have a huge backlog of capital and are always at the edge. And that's the problem with a lot of the new policies, the uncertainties, what's going to happen. I live in Canada, and 2 days ago it looked like there was going to be a huge tariff in Canada, and now there isn't for a little while. And how can people operate in such a climate? Some people like that. I happen to think Mr. Trump likes keeping people on edge because it makes him happier. But the idea of a price on carbon, ultimately, I do think that's a good idea, but it's not popular in Canada. The prime minister here there's a carbon tax, and it's one of the least popular things. It's probably one of the reasons his party will lose the next election, I think. Let me ask you, in Germany, and I'm going to say you represent all of the European Union, Sabina,
Of
um,
course.
but at least. So, what's the reaction there? Do they view this as an opportunity, or I mean, I know economies are so coupled that problems here affect problems in Europe. But is there a view that this opens up opportunities for Europe to take the lead, at least in technology, or no?
Well, certainly to some extent, the Europeans try to always be responsible and do the right thing. This is how the speeches go from
Yeah.
the European Commission and so on. But as you probably know, we have an election coming up in Germany next month.
Hmm.
And I think a lot of people are looking at this quite anxiously because Germany, for better or worse, is the biggest economy in the European Union.
Hmm.
And so we have currently in the polls leading is like the Conservative Party. But then the second is this very right-leaning party, which Musk supported,
Hmm.
and it's a climate change denial party. I went and read the party program, and I was actually shocked. I was like, they're actually like, no one knows if climate change is human caused. And I was like, what? Like, do we really still have to talk about this?
Yeah, it's amazing you do. And unfortunately, I thought that was over in the United States. The Republican Party used to have as part of its policy that we don't know if climate change is human induced. That got rid of for a while, but I think it's back again, actually. Yeah.
Well, okay, so this is a party which wants to go back to digging up coal,
Yeah.
because I mean it's literally dirt cheap and it's just lying around. So if you have energy worries, why not dig up coal? And they also want to leave the European Union. So and I think this is why I think it's very unlikely to happen.
Even with even when Musk isn't dumping as much money into that election as he dumped into the U.S. election, I guess. I hope.
Well, the Europeans have very, very strict laws on that, so it would not be a good idea. Yeah, so I actually don't think that Musk will make a big difference. We are also not seeing this in the polls. Like, it basically
Oh,
hasn't changed depending on what he said. I think a
okay.
lot of people in Europe just don't really care
Well,
what
that's
these
good.
Americans say.
That's
Blah
healthy.
blah 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 blah. Blah.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, so there's certainly going to come a big change, and we'll have to see. So I'm a little worried about what's going to happen with the climate change agreements that we have in the European Union after the election, and where that will go. Because if the United States is basically out and the European Union is kind of like, oh, we're not really sure, that's kind of the end of climate action, right?
Yeah.
Because that's a pretty big part of the world. So yeah, interesting times. I mean, to some extent, I'm not super surprised, because I've talked about this a few times before. If you look at the net zero plans that nations have put out, doesn't really
Yeah.
matter which plan you look at.
Yeah.
They're all fairy tales. Like,
Yeah.
they
They're
were
all fairy
never
tales.
realistic. Like, even
Yeah.
if you, even if you look at what they could achieve if they stuck to their promises, it wouldn't get us to net zero.
Absolutely. And, and if you look at history, the output has still been about 10 billion tons of carbon into the atmosphere. And it hasn't changed very much. I mean, it's turning a little bit, but yeah, none of those things were realistic, even if they met their commitments. But one of the things that one hopes is that, and I think I kind of thought this had happened in the US, but it's scary when you tell me about this right in part of Germany. Coal for a while was in the election before this, the last time Trump was running. Coal, he kept talking about how he was going to resuscitate coal in the United States, but that's gone away because everyone now, I think, recognizes that coal is just a bad idea for so many reasons. First of all, it's the most polluting. Many more people have died due to coal-powered plants than ever died due to any single nuclear accident. But also, it's just economically bad news too, because it employs very few people, and so it's the dirtiest fuel. It kills people. It doesn't really help the economy a lot in terms of employment, and so I don't hear the same kind of let's go coal. I hear drill baby drill, but not let's save the coal miners in West Virginia here anymore. And it'd be scary if a party in Germany actually went back as far as coal.
Well, we're still using coal, and the current plan is to phase it out by 2030.
Mm.
But I don't think it's going to happen. I think they'll just.
But
I mean,
reducing it.
energy needs to come from somewhere,
Yeah,
right? So
exactly. You can't just phase exactly. And by the way, when it comes to oil and gas, when it comes to the third world, natural gas, or if you could get it, is still much better. I mean, much of the third world uses cow dung and other things that are much more carbon producing, if you want to say it. So moving them to different fossil fuels is not a bad thing. It's a good thing. It's so one has to be wary of of anyone who sort of makes extreme statements about this. And I think you're right. We're not heading towards net zero, and climate change is inevitable. And I think ultimately we're going to have to we're going to have to work on mediation. And maybe, there's a lot of interesting carbon capture. Maybe we'll do a future episode in carbon capture. It has interesting ideas, but it's also has great practical difficulties. So we can talk about that. But I think ultimately we're going to end up, the sea level is going to rise a meter by this century minimum, I think. And we'll have to deal with that. And dealing with that in advance is very important, because there's probably between 180 and 600 million people who live less than a meter above sea level around the world. And my major concern always, by the way, with climate change has not been so much the physical effects as the geopolitical effects. What happens when you you have 100 million climate refugees? That's going to cause geopolitical problems that, they're worried about tens of thousands of refugees here in the United States. And once when I was on the TV in Australia, I said that to them. They did this big thing where they took boat people and put them on an awful place. Oh, not in Australia. but there were hundreds or thousands at most. And I said, well, look at Indonesia and look at the area around you that's not a meter above sea level, and ask yourself, what are you going to do when you have 10 million people? Where are they going to look as a good possible place to go to? Well, it's Australia. Didn't have any effect when I talked about it on TV. Anyway, okay, enough about climate for the moment. There'll be lots of time for us to talk about that in the future. My house, by the way, when I bought it, I purposely chose one that was at least about 20 meters above sea level. So, for the moment, even though I'm on the water. Okay, one of the more positive things that I was interesting. I mean, it didn't surprise me, but it was nevertheless fascinating. It's still fascinating to me that this OSIRIS-REx mission was able to return some bits of asteroid Bennu and directly to Earth, which is just still, I think, a marvelous thing, and still one of the reasons why I am so much more interested in non-human space travel than human space travel. It's so much more fascinating. Could do so much more with robots and other things. And humans, most of space, if you send humans into space, all the money just goes to keep them alive. But anyway, what this thing did was bring back a sample. And the interesting thing is, I think 14 of the 14 amino acids that are essential to life, and also 4 of the 5 nucleobases were seen on this asteroid, which, there's been there's past observations of seeing glycine and other things on comets, but this really demonstrates that rather sophisticated organic materials at the heart of what is life on Earth already exists out in interstellar space. And it is a fascinating result. And one of the big mysteries, of course, is why life on Earth developed about as soon as the laws of physics allowed it to, within a few 100 million years of the Earth's formation, when the heavy bombardment stopped due to Jupiter. And, life couldn't evolve then because the oceans would be evaporating if they were developing at that point. And of course, Francis Crick called it panspermia a long time ago, that maybe he actually argued that not just the ingredients of life, but maybe DNA itself or some sophisticated lifelike form could come from space. And in any case, this is a fascinating observation, and I think it's intriguing. At the same time, and I'll just say one more thing and then throw it to you. It's in the face of the field of this pseudo field called astrobiology has developed, and with great enthusiasm, without much data. And while there's this optimistic aspect of seeing amino acids and base pairs of nucleotides and of DNA on asteroids, at the same time, we've got now the facilities to look at hundreds, if not thousands, of planets around other stars, looking for some signs of habitable planets. And there, the results have been pretty depressing. We look for atmospheres, we don't find them, and it suggests that much of the hype about habitable planets is just that, hype. So I'll throw all that out to you and ask for your opinion about all of those things, which undoubtedly will differ from mine in some.
So first, this isn't really my specialty, but you said like this is an interstellar object. I thought it actually came from somewhere in the solar system.
It's an asteroid, so it's Bennu. I don't think is interstellar. No.
Oh, because I thought you said interstellar. Okay,
I
so
didn't
then
mean to say interstellar, but
we're-
in the interstellar medium. But I mean, okay, it
yeah,
isn't
right.
interstellar.
So
It's in the
I
solar
was
system.
I was a little confused. Yeah.
Okay.
So the other thing that's interesting is that the amino acids that they found, they are both left and right-handed, and if that's where the ones on our planet came from, they somehow must have gotten rid of all the right-handed ones. So
Well,
this mystery still remains. But I think there are 2 ways that you can interpret this. One is that we got our lives, so to say, from elsewhere, and the other possibility is that it's not as difficult to make life as we thought. Which personally I think is much more interesting because that might mean it could also have started elsewhere. So about the question like where are all the habitable planets? Well, maybe our idea of what's habitable is just too narrow.
sure. I mean, well, but it's the old statement of the drunk going under a street light to look for his keys. The first place you look is places that are like Earth or Earth-like, or that at least have water. I agree with you. The part of the problem of most of these claims about life or not life in the universe is they're based on just suppositions of which we don't even know the answer to. We don't even know how life originated on Earth. We don't know what the vast phase space of possible life forms is. We know nothing about it. We know of one example of life. And therefore, extrapolating from that one example to probabilities of finding life elsewhere in the universe is just fantasy for the most part. But the one way to tell is to look, and it certainly, if there were lots of planets that had atmospheres, that and water, then that would be optimistic, and we're not seeing that. On the other hand, I think you're absolutely right. The fact that we see these amino acids and base pairs it doesn't mean that life on Earth arose due to life somewhere else earlier, but it does suggest, as you point out, that at least making the raw materials for life is easy, and it probably was relevant for early life on Earth. But for me, it makes it more interesting to think of going to the oceans of Europa or Enceladus, um, digging under those ice, under those moons on the ice covers. This is an area I've looked at a lot because I've been tutored by people who know more than me. But if we found evidence for extinct life on Mars, it would be fascinating, of course, but it wouldn't tell us it was a separate genesis, because materials go back and forth between Mars and Earth all the time. But if you go underneath the oceans of Enceladus or Europa or somewhere else, and you find microbial life, that's a system that's been largely protected and doesn't interact with the outside. And if there were two separate geneses of life in our solar system, boy, it would suggest to me that it was ubiquitous around the world. And so this development is certainly interesting in my mind. Encourages missions, again, robotic missions, non-human missions, to look at possible places for life in the solar system, where like the moons of Jupiter or Saturn.
So how many exoplanets have they found now? Have they reached a 10,000 or?
No, it's been less than 10,000. It's more than 5,000.
Yeah.
But the interesting thing is that every time they a sort of a habitable planet, and by the way, habitable planets are defined merely to be ones that exist far enough away from their star so that it's possible that liquid water could exist. We don't know that liquid water exists on the planets, and most of those, and to be even fairer, those habitable planets, because most of the planets we see are ones close to their stars, because it's a selection effect, because those are the ones that are easiest to find, and they're around very small stars, much smaller than our sun, so they can exist much closer than our Mercury and still be in a habitable zone. They're close to stars which are producing lots of radiation and lots of upheaval. So even if there was water, and even if there were nascent life, it will likely be sterilized in those situations anyway. But even in those systems, looking for atmospheres has so far proved pretty depressing. And so, I say this because I do think that astrobiology is one area of astronomy, if you want to call it, that has more hype than any other area, of maybe even more than string theory. But it's claims that are made based on almost no evidence, and there's a lot of interesting work here going on Earth, trying to figure out how life developed on Earth. And by the way, how chirality developed, why things are left-handed. I mean, it's not so much of a mystery. There are many standard kind of chemical mechanisms that have been explored that could simply pick out one-handedness, and once life has picked out that handedness, it will continue to do that. So it's not a mystery. I had an ongoing dialogue on Twitter with some people. It's not lost on many physicists that handedness occurs in the weak interaction, where left-handed neutrinos are left-handed and have a specific chirality. And isn't it interesting that they're left-handed and life on Earth is left-handed? I tend to think that's probably just a coincidence myself.
Yeah, I don't really see this link either. But I think to come back to the exoplanets, I think you already said like the important thing in a fragment of a sentence, which is that we have an observation bias.
Yeah.
It might just be that the planets that we can readily observe are just not the ones that are likely to be habitable.
Yeah, absolutely. And Absolutely. So but what's great, to put a positive spin on this, is we have new techniques and two new observations. Science is an empirical discipline, and as much as whatever people talk about, it's nice to be able to have experiments or observations that can try and put on a solid footing. So every new observation, and the James Webb Space Telescope and new observations of asteroids, help us with that puzzle. It's still early business, but it is fascinating. I think if you'd asked, the reason it's fascinating is I think if you'd asked 30 years ago, maybe 40 years ago, if people would have thought that on asteroids or comets you'd find rather sophisticated organic materials, which suggests there's really interesting chemistry going on those things, most people wouldn't have believed it. And so anytime the standard wisdom is wrong, it's exciting for science.
Yeah, it's lots of things have changed in that area, and also with the exoplanets. Like, so
Yeah.
I'm old enough to remember that people doubted that there are any exoplanets in our galaxy, and so like there was this one observation that was like super controversial. Like people didn't want to believe it, that it was
Mm.
real,
Yeah.
and now we have like thousands.
Yeah.
And
And
it
it's
happened fairly quickly, after the first one, it was like all over the place. And now
Yeah, well, it's
we've gotten
amazing.
so
Well,
used to it.
once the technique, which I mean, the first techniques that my friend Jeff Marcy and others would use, the idea to look at the way a planet pulls a star is amazing. That you can, I'm always amazed by observers because you know these planets cause the stars to wobble because they have the gravitational attraction causes the star, while the planet is going around the star itself is doing a small orbit in response to the planet, and its velocities are like 10 meters per second, that's like a fast runner, and that you can measure that on Earth. We Doppler shifting it's just remarkable. It's part of the joy of doing science that people can do this. I'm amazed. Not me, but some people can do it. It's amazing. It's really wonderful. Well, the last topic I wanted to talk about, because it's been in the news lately, there was a Science magazine article about private companies going into nuclear fusion. Now, I'm old enough. I'm older than you, actually a lot older than you, I think. But anyway, that I remember that people would say nuclear fusion is 25 years in the future. And the point was it's always 25 years in the future. It was 25 years in the future 50 years ago, 25 years ago, and I still think now. But at the other hand, there are somehow private companies. And private companies aren't developing things because they think it's hard to imagine a business model that would have results 30 years in the future, um, being supported by private industry. It's hard to imagine investors saying, "Yeah, maybe we'll get some returns 30 to 40 years in the future." But these companies are coming in and making claims, and I have to say, based on everything I know about fusion and the difficulty, I'm highly dubious. Countries like Europe and have produced these massive things like ITER. It's extremely difficult to get the conditions necessary to have, well, it's not difficult to get fusion, but to get enough fusion to make it practical to get more power out than put in. Even when there was a lot of hype in the United States, when the laser driven nuclear fusion facility in the United States at Livermore um, had what's called break even or something. It was break even in a sense that more energy came out of those pellets than was impinging on it, but the amount of energy that had to be used to get those pellets to do things was orders of magnitude more than you got out. And in fact, those weren't being developed for energy; they were being developed for nuclear weapons studies, because you could look at how fusion happened in these deuterium pellets and or tritium pellets, so I forget. And so it wasn't even used for energy production. So if governments, which have spent tens of billions of dollars on this, are still far away, I find it hard to imagine that small private companies are going to make progress. So I don't know what your thoughts about this are.
So I've looked at nuclear fusion startups in as much detail as I could. I followed this for several years, and actually, when it comes to the NIF laser thing,
Yeah.
You already said the relevant thing, but kind of backwards. So the reason
Okay.
it wasn't super energy efficient was that the facility was built for it. It was never on the agenda. They just wanted to see, can we actually do it? Can we reach ignition? And yeah, it worked. But it also it's kind of a proof of principle, right?
Ye-
So you could say, well, now the only thing we need to do is to
Just make it better.
to do the same thing with less energy and repeat it sufficiently often, and so on. I'm not super excited about anything to do with lasers, because lasers are just chronically energy inefficient,
Yeah.
and I don't really see. I mean, I'm not a laser specialist, but it's not the approach that excites me. So but yeah, it's a little bit curious. I dig around a lot in the Internet Archive to look at what was on the websites of nuclear fusion companies like 10 years ago. And I don't know if you saw the headlines, but there was recently this company Helion. Is
Mm-hmm.
what is called Helion in the United States, which is backed, among other things, by Sam Altman. This is why it's been in the news a couple of times.
Yeah.
They got another funding round of $425 million or something, and they now have more than $1 billion.
Yes.
And so if you look at the first website that they put out in 2014, it says like within 6 years we'll have this energy producing machine. And so then you look at the website 6 years later, it still says in 6 years. So now they've moved the date several more times, and now they say we get it done by 2028. Do you want to bet on it? So
Yeah,
okay,
exactly.
yeah. Right. So, but it seems like they're getting close, and I mean, so they have built several prototypes and they have made lots of measurements. What makes this very complicated is that almost all of these companies, they're super secretive
Yeah.
about. So they don't put out papers. You don't really know what's going on. You can kind of look at the images. Sometimes one of them give like a popular level talk, and you can kind of guess what you think they're doing, but
Mm.
it's like really difficult to get a sense of how much of it is real. Yeah, so Helion is an interesting story that we could talk about for an hour, but maybe just to put things into context, what people are usually familiar with is this tokamak type
Mm-hmm.
approach,
Mm-hmm.
which is either fairly large machines, usually where you hold the plasma with magnetic field. So it's called
Mm-hmm.
magnetic confinement. You need to heat it up to several hundred million degrees. So this is the magnetic confinement approach, and then you have the what's called inertial confinement, which is what the NIF does, where you shoot with something at pellets, fuel pellets, and you can do this with lasers or with ion beams or with just solid projectiles. And then there are kind of hybrid approaches where you confine stuff with electric and magnetic fields and also shoot them into each other. And this is, for example, what Helion does. So
Yes. Yeah.
it's basically a particle accelerator.
Yeah.
So they produce like fuel bunches on two sides and shoot them into each other, and then there's supposed to be some magnetic quench or God knows, and magic happens. So basically, that's the short version. And the question is always like, can they actually do it efficiently enough so that more energy comes out than goes in? So so we know that in principle it's got to be possible. Like there's no law of nature that says you can't reach break even.
Yeah.
And so one of the reasons why I'm excited about it is that if you compare where we are now and where we were like 50 years ago, we have so much more computing power.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of this is really optimization.
Yeah.
You need the pellets. It all has to be like super finely manufactured. Or if you look at the tokamak, you need to have like intelligent feedback, which you can do
Me-
with AI,
Yeah.
to
Sure.
prevent that stuff from collapsing and so on. So I think we're in a much better position now, and I think it's quite plausible that we'll eventually get to that. The question is just how long is it going to take?
Yeah, well, I mean, you're right. That's the important part. There's no law of physics that says you can't do it, and it happens. It happens in the sun, and I've often said that the best use of fusion reactors is solar panels, because we use the energy the sun already produces it, and for free, and we get it. We get 100,000 times more energy on Earth than humanity uses, and harnessing that is a cheap way of doing it. But you're right. This Helion is a company, and it's actually worthwhile pointing out that they've changed one aspect, which is interesting, which is not normally. People are kind of surprised when they find out nuclear reactors effectively boil water. I mean, that's what the idea is, to just boil water to run a steam turbine to produce electricity. And the same idea was the idea for nuclear fusion. But what Helion is trying to do is to use these plasmas that are incredibly dense and oscillating to actually directly generate electricity. And that's an interesting new idea. And But I was just reading that at least a few people say it's incredibly unstable, and the idea is it's there. You need experiments to, um, in fact, they've argued that it's so unstable that no experiments really reproduce it very well. But I was surprised that, in fact, to read that Helion has signed an agreement with Microsoft to provide it with power by 2029, and also they are claimed to be producing a power plant situated somewhere in Washington State that's going to supply 50 megawatts. It's nice to say, and it's interesting to see them trying to do it, but notably, it's been incredibly difficult. It's a as you say, almost optimization is a huge part of the problem. But even then, the conservationist Amory Lovins used to talk about cutting butter with a chainsaw. Um, Fusion, of course, is great because it allows unlimited amounts of energy in principle, but the complexity and the technology involved is so large that one often wonder whether much lower tech uh, can get much more, and because these things are so unstable and so difficult, um, and so not only labor but financially intensive. They've required huge amounts of money. It'll be really interesting to see. I'm still skeptical um, of any 6-year timeline, and I still think 25
Yeah.
years is a better timeline. But
So, yeah, just to maybe add something to what you said about what they're doing different at Helion. So normally, in almost all other nuclear fusion approaches, one uses the heat produced in the collision or whatever you do in your nuclear fusion reaction. And then this heat is converted into electricity. So it's kind of a two-step process. You use the heat to warm
Mm.
something up,
Yeah.
some kind of medium, and then you produce electricity from that. And helium wants to do it, wants to generate the electricity directly from fast-moving protons.
Yeah.
And this is why they do something else different, and it's kind of the name is the clue. They use helium. They use helium-3 in a kind of a breeding process because that collision spits out a fast proton, and they needed a fast charged particle for to get this conversion into electricity to work. The issue with that is that the break even or the ignition temperature you need for this helium reaction is much higher than the break even temperature you need for deuterium,
Tritium.
tritium. Yeah.
Yeah.
So the thing that's their advantage is also their disadvantage to some extent.
Yeah, and then I was reading there's another company that's trying to use high temperature superconductors, creating new wires with high temperature superconductors so they can create a huge magnetic field at higher temperature. And again, I've read, it's a great idea, but the technology is difficult. And but so I mean, I guess I'm not. I guess if you're starting a company, you've got to be optimistic. But I but I just read a quote in this science article from someone who's a founder of Canada's General Fusion, one startup, saying fusion is a happening thing. I think quite a few people will achieve break-even-ish numbers, and it's nice to hear. And it's nice. I'm glad. It's important to believe you can do it, I suppose, in order to do it. Um, Interestingly enough, an investor friend of mine asked me to. I'm talking tomorrow to some people who claim to have a fusion company, and they wanted me to assess it. I'm going to go into it with a skeptical view, but we'll see. And it's nice. Um, look, it's always good for people to try, and most of the time you fail, but you got to keep trying. And so we'll see. But I'd be hesitant to invest my own money right now. Let me put it that way. I'd be very happy to invest yours, however, Sabine.
Well, actually, for what I know, I've actually looked at this. I think they're all privately owned. Like
Yeah,
they're not publicly traded. So
oh no, you have to invest it as an investor, one of these early stage investors and that sort of thing. Well, in any case, reminds me of something I think Steven Weinberg was talking about when people are asked to bet their life on whether inflation was true, and some people said they bet their life on it, and Steve Weinberg said, "Well, I'd be happy to bet his life on it." Anyway, so a little bit of healthy skepticism, and at the same time some excitement, and it's nice to be wrong and to be proved wrong, and so we'll see. And that's one of the wonderful things about science, is that we're willing to change our minds, and both Sabine and I are. And while we're usually right, we're not always right. And so we'll see what happens. And this is the first episode of What's New in Science with Sabine Hossenfelder and me. And I've really enjoyed it. Thanks a lot, Sabine. It's been a lot of fun.
Well, thank you. Thank you.
Hi, it's Lawrence again. As the Origins podcast continues to reach millions of people around the world, I just wanted to say thank you. It's because of your support, whether you listen or watch, that we're able to help enrich the perspective of listeners by providing access to the people and ideas that are changing our understanding of ourselves and our world and driving the future of our society in the 21st century. If you enjoyed today's conversation, please consider leaving a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. You can also leave us private feedback on our website if you'd like to see any parts of the podcast improved. Finally, if you'd like to access ad-free and bonus content, become a paid subscriber at originsproject.org. This podcast is produced by the Origins Project Foundation as a non-profit effort committed to enhancing public literacy and engagement with the world by connecting science and culture.